Good evening, members. At the April meeting of the committee instructed officers to prepare air quality planning guidance, which could be used for the development management process. This was to be based on the template guidance that had been prepared by the Kent and Medway Air Quality Partnership. Just as some background, the committee will be aware of the increasing importance being placed on air quality matters, both locally and nationally. Our local planning inspector judged that it was essential to maximise the chances of meeting emissions limits at the earliest opportunity by both reducing the overall number of vehicles on the road, so-called modal shift, and then also in the longer term increasing the proportion of clean emission vehicles. He recognised that the issue would be dealt with through a number of interrelated initiatives. The low emission strategy, the integrated transport strategy and the walking and cycling strategy would all have a role to play. But also importantly, there will be a new air quality DPD, which will be a specific local plan which will ensure that the Council's planning policy approach to air quality matters will be based on the latest best practice. And that DPD, once it's adopted, will have full weight in planning decisions. And the next meeting of this committee, there's going to be a report on the first scoping of that air quality local plan. But in the meantime, approving the guidance will give a framework for assessing the air quality implications of planning applications and, importantly, for securing an appropriate framework for getting mitigation against air quality impacts. So in summary, the fundamentals of the guidance are that it helps applicants to confirm when an application needs to be supported by an air quality impact assessment. And that element helps to support our current local plan policy DM6 on air quality. It provides information on the content and structure of those air quality impact assessments and indeed takes it further to actually outlining a process by which the need for the mitigation is assessed. And then we can move on to the demonstration of how the air quality impacts will be mitigated. By thirdly, the list in the guidance of practical mitigation measures that applications could accommodate within them. And that could be things like electric vehicle charging points, sustainable transport measures, potentially renewable energy technologies, and the reusing landscaping and green infrastructure to help mitigate air quality impacts. In terms of the template guidance, we've made it slightly more succinct compared with the original, and we've also adapted it so it's more specifically applies to Maidstone circumstances, in particular giving references to our air quality policy in our local plan and basically how that and the guidance dovetail together. The guidance is recommended for approval for development management purposes. I've just noticed that in your urgent update there's a slight amendment to the recommendation for absolute clarity to demonstrate, to be clear about the date at which the document will come into effect, an implementation date. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lee. I shall start from my left. Councillor Mrs. Prendergast.
I'm curious, Mrs. Lee, to know, well, I know you've explained implementation in January 2018, but why January 2018? Why not as from tomorrow? And I'd like to come back, if I may.
In relation to that, a key part of the guidance is getting mitigation, appropriate air quality mitigation actually built into schemes. So it's actually part of the scheme design. So by giving us this 2 months implementation time, it means that pre-application discussions that are taking place now, we can make sure, as of assuming the guidance is approved by the committee today, we can give developers good advance warning that they should be taking into account in developing and designing the schemes that they're working on now before they come in as planning applications. And also it's I think, as an approach of reasonableness, bearing in mind, as has been hinted at earlier on in the evening, there are a number of planning applications that are already going through the system, have already been submitted, and by having an implementation date, we're setting a clear line in the sand of when this guidance will apply from. So it'll be new applications only, not the ones that are already in the system.
I'm just a little bit concerned then, in that case, if we are adopting this, because there are key material planning considerations that I almost feel like it's because you know about the Gladman judgment yesterday, 6th of November, Newington Ponds, quashed. And it's talking about air quality, not within an air quality management area, but on the outside, and the cumulative impact. So, sorry.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, now we have an adopted local plan. The policy in that local plan has full weight in planning decisions now. This guidance is supports, but is of a less weight than the local plan policy. So planning applications now should be considered against the policies, against the criterion policy DM6, the air quality policy. What this guidance does is provide more explanation of how that policy should be applied. So it isn't that air quality considerations won't be considered until the 1st of January, but it's how the detail in this guidance should be applied. We're giving a little bit of we're giving some lead-in time to that.
Do you want to come back?
Well, I'm concerned that policy DM6 might have been kicked into touch by... I haven't had time to read this or digest it. I don't think anyone has, because it was yesterday, 10 o'clock yesterday morning, and I only had sight of it this afternoon. So I'm just concerned that we're doing the right thing, because we've been discussing cost implications, and, you know, there is plenty of potential still, our local plan just having been approved last week, for us to get caught short.
I think you're right in that it's obviously that air quality matters are increasing up the agenda in importance, both locally and nationally, with what the government is doing. And I think by the fact we're already ahead of the game in terms of we've got a new local air quality local plan timetabled in our work programme, and this is coming to you, and the scope of that is coming to you at the next meeting, shows that we're taking the matter very seriously. The guidance is, I think, presented to you as an interim measure, recognising that the local plan is progressing, that will give us help in our considerations whilst that local plan is progressing. But I absolutely accept and agree with you, this is a matter that we must keep a good watching brief on.
Councillor Mrs Springer.
Thank you. I think I might have just found the answer to my question. It was a very minor point. I was looking at page 70 where it said standard mitigation residential, and it was electric vehicle recharging infrastructure within the development. And I was going to say, are we trying to encourage that in every house from now onwards? I might just have found it on page 65. Where it says standard mitigation requirements. So I might have found it. It says residential 1 electric vehicle charging point per dwelling. Because my thoughts are we're building houses now that I'm hopeful will still be there in 50, 80, 100 years. So I would hope that we are future-proofing those properties by having at least 1 electric vehicle charging point in every property being built, because I think if we don't do that now, we're not getting a future-proof in there. So I'm not sure if I've answered my own question.
There's a sort of a short-term answer to that and then a slightly longer-term answer to that. The position we're at the moment is we do have an adopted policy on air quality DM6, which is the framework that this guidance has to sit within. That is particularly focused on impacts in the air quality management area. And so, as a consequence, that's where this guidance sits as well, in that it's developments that impact on the air quality management area are the ones where we are particularly targeting there should be mitigation. I think that air quality local plan, which I've mentioned, will be the process by which, if we can justify it, if there's evidence for it, as you say, we could build in more, perhaps more strenuous requirements more widely. But we'll need to do that through the process of the new local plan. In the meantime, this is an interim measure.
Councillor Willis.
Just on that subject about page 70 about having charging points in houses, talking having pre-access developers, it seems that affordable housing or it seems that middle-class housing is far more likely to have charging points than affordable housing, and I think that's bad, frankly, and I think we need to do whatever we can to try and, within your working groups, try and find some innovation that can find a way of a municipal charging point that, or some other examples of charging points that are available for other, not just one household, but available, what's the word, to share? Communal, yeah.
I think that's a very good point, in that it isn't, you don't only want to charge your car when it's parked at home. There is a need potentially, and it might be something the low emission strategy could also look at, of having, if you like, a strategy for where communal charging points should be, perhaps in the town centres, as a for instance. So I think, you know, that hits on a very useful point about how we should be thinking more broadly about where charging points are.
Councillor English.
Right. First of all, nothing in the judgment, which I have read, undermines the current policy position. What it does do is emphasise that that has to be a starting point and is not in any way sufficient going forward. Adopting this as a material consideration and implementing it from the 1st of January is the best option currently, because doing anything else would mean that we do not. Right, if we took option B and turned this into an SPD, there isn't much of an advantage, because effectively we will be duplicating the work needed to produce a stronger DPD, so we will be effectively producing a somewhat weaker document with the same resources over the same time scale, so I don't see the advantage. And in the meantime, we wouldn't really be able to adopt anything. So I think that we do need to go item A at the moment. Having said that, it's not a perfect document. If I was going to write it myself, I would have done it slightly differently, but writing it ourselves would be a lengthy process and would, you know, and something we'd be doing with the DPD anyway. So it is better than almost all the alternatives as a short-term option, but I stress short-term option. Having said that, I don't agree with some of the things that Mrs. Lee said. Not so much because I disagree, but it's a question of emphasis, I think. We don't need electricity charging points, for example, only in those houses that fall within the air quality management area. We need, because those cars aren't staying in the air quality management area, they're moving around the town, the country. So that's point one. So they have to be everywhere. We are encouraging developers to do that. There is a particular problem around social housing, not affordable housing necessarily, because the problem doesn't arise with part rent, part owned properties, for example. There's a particular problem in getting registered social landlords, as they used to be called, to actually engage with this process because they don't want to in most cases, and that is the problem, the problem. Secondly, actually, if we're going to get technically, nationally, the advantage of electrical charging points, actually every household in the country needs to have them. Communal charging points are useful, but to support travel infrastructure, but I think we're only really talking about a short-term issue here because, frankly, what's going to happen is that free market economics will intervene and petrol stations will become, in due course, electricity stations or whatever, or they will cease to exist because they will have gone out of business because there will not be a market for petrol-powered vehicles very much longer. This is dying technology. And the free market is not kind to dying technology, such as the internal combustion engine. So it will sort itself out. But in the meantime, we need to have robust policies for the 10 to 15 years or whatever it takes for the free market to adjust. So we need to have those policies. So this, I would say that adopt this now, but get on with the DPD as quickly as possible, because Councillor Prendergast is right. The agenda has moved on. It is moving on all the time, not just in Britain, but most importantly in China. And things are changing, and we need to change with them. Otherwise, our policies are just not going to be fit for purpose. All I would say is that a High Court judgment on planning fundamentals in itself, because it impacts on how planning law is interpreted, it is not, for example, the Newington Pond decision is in itself something that could be a material in determining matters going forward, depending to an extent on how PINS and the government respond to it, of course, but it could well be something we have to take into account going forward. I'll finish there and simply say that we will be having the Low Emissions Working Group meeting on Friday to discuss the consultation, and following from that, I really do hope we get on as a council cross-party, because there's huge cross-party support for doing more on air quality, and bring home a document as quickly as possible. We really need to. But in the short term, I propose we adopt this option A, because we need something.
Okay. I think absolutely this sets out Maidstone Borough Council's stall of expectation with developers. I think that any smart developer will be actually looking at this, particularly the electric vehicle charging points, as important to the saleability of the house in the future as fast-speed broadband. You know, it's in that league. So, as Councillor English says, the market's going to intervene here. I think that was a recommendation to move as per the papers, as per the amended recommendation on the urgent update. It has been seconded. Those in favour, please. That's unanimous and therefore carried. Thank you, members. One at a time. We're on to number 19. This is SIL Administrative and Governance Arrangements. Mr Thompson, you are going to start us off, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Council resolved to formally approve the SIL charging schedule last month and agreed the implementation date, as we heard earlier, for the 1st of October 2018. This report therefore introduces the key issues that the Council will need to address as it develops its arrangements for implementation. For practical reasons, the report breaks down these into two sets of distinct arrangements. Administrative arrangements will cover the collection of SIL monies, and the governance arrangements will cover the spending of SIL monies. The key issues identified for each set of arrangements are summarised in the table on page 85 of your papers and expanded on within the report for committee's consideration. Administrative arrangements must be established, agreed and in place for the 1st of October, if not before. The mechanics of SIL administration are highly prescriptive, highly prescribed by government. The table on page 86 of your papers sets out the requirements as they will relate to the Council as charging authority and to applicants. How the Council accommodates these new functions operationally, how the transitional period is approached, and how the neighbourhood portion is administered in parish council areas are all matters which will need to be considered further as the arrangements are developed. As touched on previously, at least one additional officer will need to be recruited to deliver these operational tasks, and existing staff will need to be trained. Given the urgency of putting these arrangements in place, the report recommends that officers are instructed to commence preparatory work for the development of the administrative arrangements. In respect of governance arrangements, government offers no prescription or guidance, and it is effectively down to the Council to establish an effective framework for decisions on spend. Amongst the key issues to be considered is the final decision-making body, how recommendations are developed, and the mechanics of the delivery agreement with infrastructure providers. How the Council works with parish councils and with local communities to develop local infrastructure priorities for neighbourhood portion spend will also be part of this process. The Council's SIL receipts must be spent on infrastructure required to support the local plan and included in the Council's infrastructure delivery plan. Given that most of the SIL eligible schemes in the IDP are already partially funded by existing 106 agreements, further detailed work will be required to inform a strategy which can make the best use of the available funding streams. It's important that the governance work is progressed in a timely manner. However, the issues and options identified within the report confirm that establishing these arrangements is likely to be a complex and lengthy process. Indeed, most charging authorities only begin to meaningfully consider governance arrangements sometime after the introduction of SIL. Therefore, remains the view of officers that resource should be focused on the development of the operational and administrative arrangements required to facilitate the effective collection of SIL monies. And that said, reflecting previous decisions of this committee, there is a clear need to undertake stakeholder engagements on both sets of arrangements, including the parish councils. This second part of the recommendation, therefore, proposes that a subsequent report be brought to this committee to set out the scope and timing of that engagement. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor English, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, I think that to an extent, developing the governance arrangements for parish areas, neighbourhood plan areas, because let's not forget that our very first neighbourhood plan was developed in a non-parish area. That's actually relatively straightforward because there is a neighbourhood planning forum established. And there are going to be issues, but that's relatively straightforward. The real problem is going to be how we do this in the urban area and the part of North Downs which doesn't have parish councils, has only parish meetings, which are not parish councils, so can't be treated in that way. So it's not just the urban area, it's that part of North Downs ward, mustn't forget that. How we treat those areas and how we come up with a solution to what is actually going to be a very complicated situation. Not least given for wards like Councillor Cox's ward, East Ward, my own, and Phantom Bridge, which are mostly residential but include a fair bit of the central business district. That is going to be one heck of a headache. I'm not proposing a solution at the moment, but I have to, because there's work, but I have to say I think that is going to be really difficult. What I would say is that we need to ensure that that process is reasonably inclusive, but that we don't produce a process so bureaucratic that all the money gets spent on administration and consultation. I would also point out that there will need to be consideration of how this whole process overlaps with outside stakeholders, some of which will be local authorities, some won't. And in the town centre area, if the business improvement district goes ahead, it's going to get even more complicated because we will need to consider how this overlaps with that to a certain degree, because we don't want too many people trying to manage the same essential pot of money and the same set of priorities. So I'll leave it there, but I have to say that I think that is going to be really difficult.
Councillor Wilby?
It's more about some of the key issues in G5. I've been involved in a local parish. My point's really drawn to 1.55, with the spend and neighbourhood portion of the monies must support the development of the area. It's critical and clear framework of protocol in place to ensure that the money is spent in accordance with legal requirements. Now, I'm not saying that most parishes aren't capable of doing that, but are we going to give them training on those legal requirements? Are they going to give them a brief? Also, is it our place to tell them where to spend their 25% or 15%? Because when I read the seal agreement before, it didn't mention anything about this coordination between Maidstone Borough Council and the parishes. It seems to be an afterthought about the money.
Mr Thompson, do you want to add anything to that, or?
I think, the purpose of the report generally is just to introduce a lot of these fairly complex and detailed issues, and you're quite right, this is perhaps one of the more complex among them. I think what's critical is that through the development of sort of formalised arrangements, there is a very clear process by which the parishes can understand how the money should be spent, and there are specific legal requirements within the regulations as to what the monies can or cannot be spent on. And in the case of any sort of misspending of the money, as it were, there are potential implications which could cause greater difficulty down the line. So I think as long as it's very clear through the establishment of the formal arrangements, where the line is, I suppose, then that situation shouldn't arise.
Mr Fitzpatrick might just be able to assist as well there.
I think it's going to be a bit of a learning curve for all of us, but my understanding is that the parish council simply applies to us and says this is what we want to spend the money on, and we simply give them a notification. The only time we would get involved is if we are unhappy or disagree, if I'm not mistaken. Is that not the case?
So there's a question from an answerer there.
Thank you, Chairman. I think what that illustrates is that there's an awful lot of work which we will need to do as well as officers as to how the processes and mechanics will work when it comes to both administrative and governance arrangements. I am aware, and I've been in contact with other districts and boroughs within Kent to try and see how they're getting on, because they are all at different parts of this, different stages in the process. And I have to say that that's the point raised by the legal officer is one of the key issues which we will need to get some detail and further information on. But I think the point being made here by Mr Thompson is that we acknowledge now that there are going to be some quite complex issues that we deal with, both administratively and in terms of governance. We wanted to make sure that they were highlighted to committee, and also the point that the administrative matters we really need to focus our emphasis on at this stage, whilst having regard to the governance matters and getting a head start on those. But the administrative matters are the ones which are really going to be key to have in place by the October date. Now, I'm proposing that we deal with both the administrative and governance matters, but emphasis has to be on the administrative, and there's a lot of work to do on the governance.
Mr Jarman.
Yeah, like Councillor Wilby alluded to, there are relatively broad parameters for parishes in the example Councillor Wilby's using. But as Mr Thompson says, in 1.55 of his report, the essential thing is that the parish councils spend it on support in development in the area. Support.
Please do.
It was my understanding, reading the government seal paper, that the parish or the neighbour, if you had a neighbourhood plan, they would hold the money, not they apply to the council to spend the money. Because obviously the sums you're talking about, there could be a potential bit of interest or investment that they could be doing with that money while waiting.
Please.
Grateful to the Councillor for his comments. That's my understanding. Thank you.
So I think the world of SIL is something that perhaps in the future we'll say, careful what you wish for, but we're there. I think the important thing is to instruct officers tonight to crack on with getting the framework and the arrangements in place, because this is not a 5-minute exercise. And I think we've reiterated previously the importance to work with the parish councils and the neighbourhood forum groups and whoever else is involved. And I think the constructive way forwards will be to get some initial thoughts so that we've got a framework to have those conversations around, rather than a blank sheet of paper where we're all scratching our heads. So, I absolutely support that we go with the recommendations this evening. Councillor Wilby.
Could I make a suggestion that sometimes we offer the parish councillors the training to do with SIL. Generally, the clerk will help see most of the parish councillors on those parish councils. Maybe it'd be more beneficial to offer the training to the clerk, seeing that she's the legal officer for the parishes.
I don't want to preempt future debate, but having been involved with parish council previously, for example, their audit requirement is relative to the size of the funds that they hold. You could have a parish where ultimately they end up with a spare £500,000 or £1 million, potentially. That will throw their financial controls into a totally new arena. And I think the kind of thing that we need to think about is maybe being able to offer them some tools where we can use our governance framework to assist them with compliance. But these are very early thoughts. But let's get some thoughts on paper and engage in those conversations. I think I'm next to Councillor Mrs Springett.
Thank you. I would just like to emphasise, I think we need to somehow give some very clear guidance to parish councils on how they manage it. And also, could consideration somehow be given in this? Obviously, development in, as an example, Bearsted, the SIL money would come to Bearsted. But where you have a development adjacent to a ward or to a parish that impacts more on that parish than the parish that it's sitting in, consideration needs to be given as to how that is handled. And there are, I'm sure, certainly I have them in my ward, where a development is adjacent to one parish, will impact all those houses and the occupants will impact on that parish, but the money goes to the parish council up the hill. So I don't know if there's any thoughts on how that works now that we're sort of expanding outside of traditional parish boundaries.
Rather than invite suggestions and answers to that question, I think what we're just realising here is how complex this is going to be, how much learning we've all got to do about what the rules are. So, can I... sorry, could you repeat that?
Were we doing agenda item 14 with this one as well? Just a thought, are we sort of including that in this pot? Because I think we deferred that to discuss at this time. That was the S1. Oh, is that another one?
No, that's agenda item 20. We might.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Just checking.
Councillor Wigginer.
Briefly, Mr. Chairman, I mean, clearly we're all thinking about the issues we're going to have, and obviously with the parishes, and certainly some parishes we have to start dialogue quite soon. A number of them are clearly expecting to be dealing with an awful lot of money, and we'll need to discuss that with them. So clearly we have got to start arranging now how we are going to manage this. I think that this came up with a few interesting questions, whether we should have a separate SIL committee, God help us, I hope not, and how we would deal with outside organisations if we would, what decisions we're going to make about broad splits of funds if we do that and if we don't. And I think we just need to get on with working out how we're going to manage this. So I would just absolutely move that we go straight ahead with this.
I'm going to move the recommendations from the Chair. Is there anybody that feels absolutely burning desire to add Any last comments? Councillor Mrs Prendergast had indicated.
So I just want to reinforce or add to what Councillor de Wigendine just said. You know, representing 4 rural parishes and on a wider scale 15, I just really think that it's important that we have early engagement with them on the administrative and the governance, because I would hate to see this being presented to them as a fait accompli further down the line. I really do think that will backfire on us very, very badly.
I think we all share that sentiment, absolutely. Councillor English.
I remember proposing to the relevant scrutiny committee, when it was scrutiny committee, that we actually put down on paper that the governance arrangements for SIL should actually be consulted on with parish councils before they were adopted, and that was, I think, unanimously agreed, and I thought that was where we were going. I have to say, I started off this discussion quite sanguine. Now I'm getting quite alarmed, actually. I think the urban area is complicated. I don't think, frankly, the governance issues or the arrangements for SIL for parish or neighbourhood plan areas should in any way be complicated. What it says, very broadly, I won't go quote it tonight, in the government regulations is essentially that the parish councils and neighbourhood plan areas should have wide discretion within a certain broad parameters. We must be very beware of becoming some paternalistic, bureaucratic nanny telling parish councils what's good for them. We must not do that. We must be as enabling as possible and as flexible as possible. Whilst parish councils may have their faults, most of them are quite capable of handling the sort of sums of money we're talking about and the arrangements that would be necessary. If they weren't, they'd fail the audit. Well, bear in mind that some parish councils in Maidstone already have millions of pounds running through their accounts. We're not talking about toy town organisations here in many cases, and the ones who've got neighbourhood plans through are normally the best organised, best managed. That's how they got them through. So frankly, I want to put on paper now that I really think we should be beware of having complicated governance arrangements. We need a very simple protocol which sets out broad parameters within which, and we should be handing the money within those parameters to the parish councils responsible to spend it themselves on what they wish to do within those parameters. We don't need to have a bureaucratic grant application system. These aren't pupils applying for support to go on a holiday in a sixth form college. These are local government councils. Let's treat them like adults.
I don't think that any members at this table have suggested anything other than that.
I think the whole thrust of this paper could be read as saying, no, we need to hold their hands, manage them and direct them through it. I'm sorry, that's how it reads.
Last word, Councillor Willis. We go to a vote if I've got a seconder.
Officer Thompson. What is SIL? No, that's a joke. Can we have some SIL training for members? Is that obviously it will happen, but can it happen sooner rather than later? Because I'm representing an urban area, and obviously we don't have the luxury of a parish. We have a friendly parish nearby, but can we have some SIL training ASAP? I don't want to go off the papers, but.
Shall I take them in order?
Well, no need to respond to that. I mean, I think the appropriate workshops will come along in due course. I'd like to think that we have a reasonable understanding, given we were all voting whether we should implement it or not very recently. And that, I think, is precisely what this report sets out, that there will be further reports to us explaining the options and setting out how it works. I've moved as per the papers. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Mrs Gooch, I think you were the first hand up there. I'll move straight to the vote. Those in favour, please. Do I have everybody's attention? Those in favour? Those against? Abstentions? That is carried. One abstention. All others for. Members, let's move swiftly along. We're at agenda item 20. This is the government consultation, planning the right homes in the right places. There is a consultation response submission deadline, which is tomorrow. So I think it is reasonably important that we do conclude this item this evening. Mrs. Lee, can I hand over to you?
Thank you. This government consultation follows on from the Housing White Paper that was published in February. It covers a number of matters and asks quite a raft of questions, which is the reason why the response in Appendix 1 is rather lengthy, and I won't go through it in detail. We, in fact, had a very useful members' workshop last month where we were able to talk through the content of the document and understand some of the implications. So we did some of that background at that members' workshop. I think the most high profile of the proposals is the government's proposed methodology for calculating our housing target. The government's concerned about the time and cost and debate revolving around setting that objectively assessed need figure, and basically wants to reduce that on all fronts. And so they've come up with a standardised approach which stems from household projections, but then applies an affordability factor where the relationship between average house prices and average household incomes is most acute. As I've said, the outcome of the government's approach is that we do end up with a very simplified approach, but by virtue of being so simple, it is very, very blunt. And for Maidstone, if we were preparing a local plan at this point in time, our housing requirement would, under this new methodology, become 1,236 dwellings per year, compared to what our adopted local plan says, which is 883. So in the proposed response, just to highlight some key points, it observes that the new approach penalises authorities which have performed well in the past. It perpetuates established patterns of household growth and disproportionately loads future requirements on authorities that have high base populations like Maidstone and which have delivered, as I've said, good levels of housing in the past. And as an example and as an illustration, authorities like Sevenoaks and Tunbridge Wells see proportionally lower increases, notwithstanding that their affordability problems are actually worse. The consultation sets out proposed transitional arrangements for this new system, and which would see Maidstone's current figure of 883 dwellings per annum. Now, because that's in an up-to-date local plan, under these proposed transitional arrangements, that figure will be secured until the plan is reviewed. And so the proposed draft response supports that as an approach, but in the urgent update that's before you, we've just added an initial underlining to emphasise that the government should just assert that approach, that basically up-to-date local plans figures remain extant when they make their changes to the NPPF and the relevant national planning guidance as well, just so there is no debate going forward. Also in the urgent update, we've made a refined response concerning the proposed 40% cap. The government is proposing a cap on the housing needs figure that shouldn't increase above 40% of your current figure. The original response was silent on that point, and so we've now added in a proposed response that basically supports the principle of the cap, because at least it does put a cap on the potential increase, but also indicated that we'd quite welcome if it was a bit lower than 40%. Just briefly on other matters raised in the consultation, the government is formalising the requirements around duty to cooperate, requiring authorities to produce statements of common ground with their with other authorities, most particularly and most likely their neighbours, throughout the plan preparation process. And I really think this is a move towards a change in the dynamics of duty to cooperate, very much towards starting to get to a duty to agree. The response highlights there's some quite practical difficulties with authorities that are at different stages in the plan-making process, and indeed have different evidential bases for their plans. The government also wants to give certainty to groups preparing neighbourhood plans by requiring local authorities to provide a housing requirement figure for each neighbourhood area, and that would be on a simple apportionment basis. And the government's also proposing to simplise guidance on viability assessments, and is re-announcing the proposal for local authorities to be able to increase planning fees by 20% where criteria are met. And both these moves are welcomed in principle. As the Chairman has indicated, the deadline for this consultation is coming up, and the submission will be made online. The response agreed by the committee, whatever that is, will be made online by that deadline. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lee. Very thorough response. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to start with Councillor English and move around from there.
Right. Well, this consultation is very worrying, not just for us in the south east of England. I think, to be honest, it has almost as much of a negative impact on the north of England. And whilst I appreciate that this is a response on behalf of NBC, it might have been worth making the observation that whilst the effect on the south east of England around London is of overheating the economy, that there is a big risk that this will have the opposite effect in the north of England and runs very much counter to the government's stated economic strategy. And I really do think that if I was writing a response, I would have put that in, because it's going to be quite hard for a lot of local authorities in the north of England to get the quantum of development they need on using this assessment. Now, secondly, and more directly related to what has been written here, I think, to be honest, the government has focused on the wrong, as usual, on the wrong end of the stick here. The reason housing delivery is bad in large parts of the country has got absolutely nothing to do with planning authorities, or it's got everything to do with the fact that if you're going to make a profit on housing, you don't build it all at once. The British construction industry has serious capacity issues. If it's going to produce a lot of more housing in a short time, government has to address that, has to address the capacity and skill shortage issues in the construction industry. I don't see any response from us on that line, and I really do think when we're talking about government action to speed up the release of housing land, we should be talking about measures to actually do something about the lack of capacity in this construction industry. Finally, I think at the end of the day, you can't make people do anything without actually having the appropriate market mechanism. And whilst the supply of capacity to the construction industry can be improved, what will really make them to start delivering is serious fiscal measures that make it expensive to hang on to undeveloped land for long periods of time. And frankly, this was in Lloyd George's budget in 1918 and going to go through because of opposition from his coalition partners. It should be done now. We should be looking at fiscal measures to actually make it expensive for developers to just land bank. And frankly, unless that's done, we can talk about all the delivery methods and speeding up housing delivery in this country so the cows come home, and it won't happen, because it will simply not be profitable for developers to do that, because house prices might actually come down long term. And whatever the government says, business people don't want prices of their product to fall, do they?
Fine speech. Are there particular things that
I thought I did mention three. You did, but
things. It went on a while. We may have forgotten. Could you just reiterate them?
Right. Let me be right. First, the point about the corollary of overheating in the south east of England being that this risks development of the economy in the north of England, the Midlands, and this runs counter to government economic policy, point one. Point two, there is an issue of capacity and delivery in the construction industry, and the government needs to address that. Point three, I agree with taking measures to do something about countering the slow release of land, but I think we probably should say this may need to include fiscal measures.
Very nice and concise the second time around. Mrs. Lee, do you want to pick up on any of those points as to where they are mentioned or not, or I think some may be covered?
Yeah, I don't think we particularly picked up on the differentiation north and south, so certainly that can be added. Bottom of page 112 does touch on the issue of capacity within the building industry, but very happy to make more of that and expand on that. And then similarly onto the top of page 113, again it touches on potential sanctions on landowners and developers around planning permissions, but again very happy to make more of that. You'd like those strengthened, would you? Can I just take a sort of consensus view? All members happy that those points are done? Right. Okay, that's good. I'm moving round. There's nothing. Councillor Willis, go on. Your turn.
Quick question to Officer Lee. 1.16. I wasn't at the members' workshop, but it sounds quite interesting. I just wonder what views of the committee were on that. 1.16, page 104. The committee is invited to consider if it would like to incorporate this proposal in a consultation response. So a tax on heavily penalise empty or second homeowners. Empty more than second home, I think, probably. Yeah, so could you... Obviously, yeah.
It's left open because it's quite, in my interpretation, it's quite a sort of political point if the committee wants to make it, perhaps rather than purely planning.
Councillor English. Councillor Willis has raised the point. You've said you're putting the question to us. So on that point, is there something we want to add to the result? Are you making a suggestion, Councillor Willis?
It refers to heavily penalise empty. Second home owners, I think, is well, if you want to talk about that, fine, but empty. Your point referred to land banking, didn't it?
I think the point is too narrow that the committee made about empty properties. The issue is broader. Land includes buildings. So I think fiscal measures is broader and includes essentially that point without being so specific. If you get tied up on specific points of detail like that, we end up risking missing the broader picture.
Did everybody follow what was being said there? So, no changes to the response as drafted?
Apart from the three I mentioned.
Apart from the other points, yes, but on that matter, members are content as it sits. Very good. Councillor Mrs Gooch.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much for this report. Well, the draft responses, I think they're very good. I've got no problem at all with them being blunt. I do think that being succinct and to the point gets the point home. May I just comment on page 116, your response to question 9, you've just put as for question 8. I just feel it's, let's be sure, can we just repeat what you put for question 8 in there? Because we don't know how it's going to be processed at the other end, and if they cut and paste, we could be in trouble. So, thank you. But other than that, great. Thank you, Chairman.
Valid point. I don't think any of us have a problem with that. Thank you. Councillor Mrs Springett.
Thank you. Just a little comment on the empty, would we want to heavily penalise empty homes? You'd have to put a very careful time limit on that. You'd have to be really, really careful with that, because there are houses that are empty because they're being sold and in between tenants, and I think you've got to be careful. So that's just a note of caution on that point. I think, Councillor English, your comment on sanctions financial against developers is raised on page 121, where under build out. And I don't know if you want to strengthen that, if that's what you were getting at. You just want to strengthen that wording. Okay. And then this is just for me. This is an idiot moment, please. Where it says changes to the MPPF and MPPG should underline that the new calculation should not apply until an up-to-date local plan is reviewed. Is there a date on that? So what I'm asking is, we're just about to start our review. So do we need to clarify that until the local plan review is adopted, completed, because the minute we start reviewing it and start talking big numbers, I know that's where you're trying to go in that answer. I just wonder if we need to clarify that the adoption of the review, because once we start reviewing, we start talking bigger numbers. We've now got developers going, excuse me, it might be me interpreting it wrong, but
no, I don't think you are, because I think it's just not clear, and until we have the government guidance, we won't know exactly what they mean about at the point at which a plan is reviewed. What I would say is, and taking the example of the recent local plan that we've adopted, it has a base date of 2011, so effectively our numbers applied from the base date of the plan. So without predicting what the government guidance will be based on the experience now, I'd say it would be from the base date of the review, whatever that turns out to be.
Please, Mr. Egerton.
Thank you very much. Yes, I take you on, but just adding to what Mrs. Lee is saying, I think that it is quite imperative that we make it absolutely clear that from our point of view, we must see the review through to the end before these new targets actually apply, and we'll make sure that that's included.
I think we understood what you were saying. We were just a bit shocked about the ramifications of it, perhaps. Did you have further to add, or...?
Is that something you'd like built into the response? That
I think we need absolute clarity. I mean, you're referring to it as the base date, but to me that is 2021, albeit I know at a certain point we're going to pick a number and then work on it, but we need to be certain. It's a review, it's not a new plan. You know, the plan is extant until the review is adopted, is I think the way we need to view this. Okay,
Chairman, just one point. I realise councillors are just dealing with quite an important matter there. It is not possible for us to take it through to those sort of dates. There is actually a cut-off of 5 years set by the government, so which, yeah.
Councillor Mrs. Prendergast.
Mr. Egerton, sorry, I'm possibly, Mrs. Lee, I'm possibly being a bit slow here myself, though. So if we're talking about the end of the review period, what happens to the broad locations like Lenham, where we're not talking about building out till the end of the plan period? Are they likely to get dumped on horribly from a great height?
We've yet to determine new policy. Isn't it? That's the point. Unless we review those broad allocation policies, they will stay as is, unchanged. Okay, can I just venture one thing? It's maybe outside of the questions, but there is the question or response relating to the uplift in planning fees, the 20% thing. Can we go further and actually saying that we need more than this? We need to be able to recover the cost of determining planning applications, not regime of charging structure. It would get completely around the whole PPA thing if you could actually charge what it costs rather than having a limitation. So, I've already written to the Secretary of State about this, so if he gets it from this angle as well, then perhaps we could win.
If you want to propose that, Mr. Chairman, I'm quite happy to second it.
Right. So, members, I can see that we are getting distracted now. So, everybody happy with that last addition? Right. That's concluded and agreed as a response, and we'll leave that in your capable hands, Mrs. Lee, to make sense of that. I think that concludes that item. Now, members, it is 9:45. I don't think that we've got any chance of getting through the last item of the agenda sensibly, which means that we will be calling the adjourned meeting date, which means that we could take the next two items with fresh minds on the same day, or do you wish to deal with those items of business tonight?
I think we can certainly do the housing delivery test update fairly quickly, I would have thought. It depends. I don't have massive changes I want to propose on the public art policy. As such, I'm fairly... But no, it's up to the office.
I'm reading that as you're keen to proceed. I'm interested to know what other members would like to do. Do you want to deal with the other two, or do you want to hold it all until Monday? Right.
I put a motion that we hold it.
Right. Okay, Chairman's decision then is that we will adjourn the meeting at this point, and that the rest of the agenda, item 21 forwards, and my apologies to officers who have waited so patiently, but I don't think we will be doing full justice to any further items. Yes, and there's some quite technical consideration about it. So, agenda is adjourned at this point, and we reconvene, that being the case, on Monday the 13th, 6:30, same place. My thanks to you all, especially officers, and I wish you all a good evening.